Hey, I'm Sam from Prismic. I'm here with Rich Harris, creator of Svelte, and Rich is explaining to me how you can get rich quick by creating your own JavaScript framework. Thanks for joining me, Rich.
Thank you, if only.
Just for starters, why did you create a web development framework?
The existing ones just weren't really ideal for the problems that I was trying to solve. I was working in newsrooms using JavaScript to tell stories interactively, and it's hard. It's really, really hard to build applications that work performantly and reliably across browsers on a tight deadline. And particularly around the time that I started, tooling wasn't really there. And so it was very much, as is so often the case for open source developers, I was scratching my own itch. And then having done that, put it on the internet, see if other people want to use it. And it turns out that a lot of people had the same problems that we did. And so it kind of took off and gained an audience from there.
What was your first inkling that other people were actually going to use it?
So Svelte was a follow-up to a previous effort called Reactive, which had gained a small but fairly dedicated following. It was used in a few different places. And so there was sort of a ready-made community for that. So when I started talking about Svelte, there was an existing audience of people who were quite keen to give it a try. And it also had some ideas that at the time I think were fairly novel. Like we called it the magical disappearing framework, because the idea was the compiler, instead of being this code that runs alongside your application code, it's a compiler that takes your declarative component input and turns it into vanilla JavaScript manipulation. And so people who are very interested in the performance aspects of building web applications, people who are very interested in minimizing bundle size, that's the sort of developer that was initially attracted to Svelte. And so it had a hook. There was a thing that it was very obviously and measurably doing better than existing frameworks, and that appeals to some people.
Those people who are interested in it, how did they find it? Did they follow you on Twitter? Did they see it on GitHub?
Yeah, Twitter and GitHub have always been the main ways I think people find this stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if some energetic young web developer wanted to create their own JavaScript framework, what would you say to them?
I would say, first of all, absolutely do it. You learn so much in the process of building any open source project. You understand the decisions and the trade-offs that teams that have already done these sorts of things have made much more keenly than you can as a passive observer. And you learn a huge amount in the process. But I would also say, try and be clear-eyed about what your goals are if you're going to do this. Are you doing it for your own amusement? Are you doing it because you think you genuinely have a new idea that is meaningfully different from what exists out there already? And do you intend for this thing to get adoption? And if it does get adoption, what is your plan for this being a sustainable open source project over the years? A lot of people, I think, begin open source projects without thinking about any of that stuff. I am absolutely guilty of that. You build something and then suddenly it turns out that people are depending on it. If you had told me that I would still be working on Svelte 7 years in and that I wouldn't consider it anywhere near finished back when I started, I'd have been like, that's just an absolutely incomprehensible thought. Why would I embark on this journey? But there is not just building the thing itself, which is a substantial endeavor, but managing contributions in the community, writing documentation, writing tests. There are so many things that you just don't tend to think about until they are foisted upon you.
I feel like you're saying
it's a lot.
I feel like you're saying completely opposite things. One is yes, absolutely do it. 2, be aware of how crushing the workload will be.
Yeah. Well, I think both can coexist. If the first one is you're building stuff for your own education and enjoyment, and I think people should absolutely do that. I hate the idea that sometimes people deride that as NIH syndrome, not invented here. Everyone wants to build their own thing.
Yeah.
And it's so good. It's so healthy. People should embrace that. It's one of the great things about our industry is that anyone can build this stuff and ideas can truly come from anywhere.
Yeah,
but
great.
if it is going to be more than just an experiment and a personal side project, then the responsibilities do mount up very quickly.
On the technical side, what kind of things do you need to know in order to build a JavaScript framework?
So it really depends what kind of framework you're building. I think most frameworks today have more or less settled on signals as the underlying primitive for describing how changes of state flow through your application. And so understanding how signals work is obviously a great place to start. If you want to build something more Svelte-like, in other words, a compiler, then you need to have some basics of compiler theory, how parsers work, how to use an abstract syntax tree and turn that into some compiled output, JavaScript or TypeScript. And these are all things that, like, there's a lot of resources out there. Like it's a lot of this stuff is honestly pretty easy to learn. Mm-hmm. If you're so inclined, you just need to know the things to search for.
And those things, parsers, abstract syntax trees, are those things that you figured out how to write yourself, or were there libraries or tools available for you to use?
There are tools available. There are parser generators that you can use. Like if you want to describe your language in terms of a standard grammar, then you can turn that into a parser that will generate the syntax tree for you. Although honestly, like a lot of it, I think a lot of us sort of stumbled into from first principles, just from like tinkering around. If you want to parse JavaScript, then that's pretty straightforward. There are libraries out there. I use Acorn a lot. Is one of the granddaddies of the JavaScript parsing world. You give it some JavaScript code, and it gives you this tree structure that is just a JavaScript object that you can walk over and understand the structure of a piece of code. You're not finished at that point. Like you need to understand how all of the different parts of that abstract syntax tree relate to each other. Like if you have a variable declared somewhere, and then you have a reference that has the same name somewhere else in the abstract syntax tree, how do you know that it's referring to that variable declaration and not some other variable declaration that happens in an unrelated scope? And so there's like a lot of interesting problems that you have to solve along the way, but that's really the starting point. A website that I absolutely love and use almost every day is astexplorer.net. Will, if you go there, you can try out a whole bunch of different parsers. JavaScript, TypeScript, CSS parsers, HTML parsers, loads of parsers. There's even a Svelte parser in there.
And when you say AST, you're not talking about Atlantic Standard Time. You're talking about
AST, abstract syntax tree.
What is an abstract syntax tree?
It is a structured representation of a piece of code. So code is just it's a byte string, right? It's a sequence of characters. It doesn't have any structure, but in order for you to understand what's happening in the code and for you to convert it into some other form, then you need some structured representation, and that is what a syntax tree is. It's just a JavaScript object that represents the same thing, but in a tree form instead of a sequence of characters.
Okay. How do you think about the difference between a framework and a library?
Honestly, those words have lost all meaning for me at this point. I think that the classic definition is like a library is a thing that you call, and a framework is something that calls your code. I don't know that description is all that helpful anymore. I kind of think of a framework as being the set of idioms that you use when you're building an application. Like a framework really determines to a large extent how you think about the objects inside your application. It gives you a vocabulary that you can use and that is shared with the other people working on that code base. And so a lot of things that technically might be libraries really feel a lot more like frameworks because they are sort of governing how you go about solving problems in your code base.
When you start a project like this, do you think it's important to make a distinct distinction between which path you want to go down, whether or not you want to make the tool or, like you said, that guiding set of idioms?
I think what's important is to know what outcome you're trying to achieve. I'm a big proponent of something called README driven development. Whenever I start a new project, I will usually start with the README
Oh.
I will often, write the usage notes, like, here's what you import and here's how you use it before I've written a line of code. And that way you will learn very early on that, oh no, that API doesn't make any sense, or that's really cumbersome to use, or these two things don't coexist very well together. And once you've done that, once you've written the README, the implementation is often the easy part.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if you take that sort of use-centric mindset, then you'll naturally be guided in the right direction, as opposed to thinking too much in terms of like how the code should work under the hood.
So a use-centered mindset makes me think about something that obviously the Svelte team puts a lot of thought into, which is API design. What are the rules of good API design?
I don't know that there are rules per se. It is something that we think about a lot, and I don't think we've ever really managed to encapsulate it. I think a lot of it really comes down to taste and experience, if I'm honest. A lot of times we find ourselves asking each other, does this feel like Svelte? And there are no hard and fast rules for when something is or is not Svelte-like. It's just kind of a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
That has been honed over the years of working on this and having seen which things bear fruit and which things, you eventually come to regret. I think there are some sort of tests that you can apply to things, like how well does this compose with our other APIs? How alike is this to our other APIs? Like, does this feel coherent and consistent? And, you can, I guess these are all C words, composable, coherent, consistent. There are probably some others. And if you can sort of reduce it to those words, then it will often like prompt the right discussions. But I don't know that there are any rules of API design that shouldn't be broken with at least some regularity.
Okay. Are there any resources that you recommend that you've used over the years for designing Svelte?
None that spring to mind. I think the biggest resource that we've used is people's reactions. We'll do a lot of our work in the open as much as possible. We'll discuss things internally in small groups and then gradually widen it. And then frequently, once it gets to the stage of, here is an idea that we're not completely ashamed of, and we'll put it on, in a GitHub discussion or in an issue thread, we get a pretty clear sense at that point of whether we've misstepped, because people will tell us.
Yeah.
People are very not shy about telling us when something is the wrong decision. And that's a luxury that we have, because we have like a very engaged community. Mm-hmm. Not every open source project has that luxury, either because it's too small, or in some cases because it's too big. You either get not enough signal or way too much noise. But we're kind of in a sweet spot where we get really good feedback from people, and that helps keep us on the straight and narrow.
You've said that when you started building Svelte, if I remember correctly, that you put a lot of emphasis into the speed and performance and the optimization, and people didn't really engage that much with that language. And then when you started talking about how easy it was to use, people like jumped on it. How do you prioritize, between those great qualities that we all know of as really virtuous, and just like marketing to people because it's easy?
Yeah, I mean, we sort of think of our job as being maximizing developer happiness without sacrificing user happiness. In the W3C's priority of constituencies, the user comes over the developer, and we try and embody that. But at the same time, like it's true that developers really do respond to developer experience. And you can tell everyone that your thing is the fastest and the lightest thing, and some people will care. Some people care very deeply about that stuff, but most developers are like, well, if I've got to live with this thing, if this is going to become part of my code base and I have to stare at this code a lot, then it's got to be code that I enjoy writing.
Yeah.
And that's fair. Like there's no reason that shouldn't be a high priority. And the tightrope that we have to try and navigate is tightrope that we have to try and navigate is achieving like as ideal as possible the developer experience without introducing things that are going to be slow. So an example of that would be, we talked in a previous video about introducing proxies for state, so that the properties of objects become reactive, and we do that by generating proxies. And like that is a thing that makes developer experience way better. It's like super nice, but there is a tiny bit of overhead there. And so there is a trade-off. And so when we hit those situations, we spend a lot of time benchmarking and measuring and really understanding what the impact of those choices is going to be. And like I think that's appropriate. I think it's on framework teams to think deeply about those things so that the average developer doesn't need to spend a lot of time thinking about those things.
When does Svelte end? What's the timeline? When is Svelte over?
It's a little hard to say from this vantage point. I mean, we've been working on it for 7 years at this point, which I think is like you're starting to get into the typical life cycle of one of these projects, like quite far into it. But at the same time, it hasn't really been a force in web development for more than a few years. So we still feel like we're a fairly early stage framework.
It's still seen as the up and comer, the new one.
It is. We are still seen as like the hot new thing, even though in many ways we're the framework that has changed the least over the last few years. At least until Svelte 5 is released, at which point there'll be some quite substantial changes. The framework up until that point has been very, very stable indeed.
Let me back up a little bit first, because I was very presumptuous in that question. Is it something you think about? Do you think about Svelte as a project that has an end date?
We don't exactly plan for it to have an end date. I mean, we still feel like there is so much work to be done. Our list of to-dos is endless. And there's a lot of work that we're very excited to get into. Obviously, Svelte 5 is occupying all of our time at the moment. But beyond that, we have so many far-ranging conversations about what Svelte 5.1, 5.2, 6.0, 7.0 could look like, what SvelteKit 3, 4, 5 could look like the kinds of things that we want to enable people to do. We talk about that stuff all the time, and I'll be sad if we don't get to do all of that stuff. But at the same time, we are realists. The reality is that everything that people assumed was going to be a fixture of web development for many, many years to come eventually peters out. Like when I started out in programming, it was around like 2010, 2011. And at the time, like I knew nothing. And I was asking around people who had a little bit more nous than me, like, what should I be learning? And everyone's like, oh yeah, Flash, you got to learn Flash. Right? And of course, that is exactly the moment at which Flash was put out to pasture. And I think about all of the things that have been and gone since then, things that were considered like essential things to learn, and which nowadays are not really talked about. Like in many cases, they're still used very widely. Like jQuery, for example, is still an extremely dominant force in web development. It's just not talked about. But there are a lot of projects that have kind of had their time. And that will be true of React one day, and it'll be true of Svelte too. And we need to be mindful of that and at peace with that at the same time as we're trying to do all of the things that we want to do with the project.
Now, I asked about this. Actually, you planted the seed a couple months ago. You were talking about bringing a specific Svelte syntax in line with the HTML spec, which was sort of a bit of a pedantic issue, but also a pretty profound philosophical issue about the nature of web development. But at the time, you said HTML will outlive Svelte, so we need to respect HTML. What did you have in mind for that? I mean, why did you feel like you needed to say that?
I mean, but partly it's just there's a level of humility that comes with having been around the block for a while and having seen projects come and go. Like it's just true that Svelte isn't going to be around forever. And partly it's when we think about what we want to achieve with Svelte, it's not dominance. We don't want everyone to be using Svelte forever. What we're really trying to do is bring ideas into the conversation about what web development should look like. And as part of that, we're thinking about what do we want to leave people with. If people come to the Svelte community and they use Svelte, that's great. If they then leave the Svelte community, what do they take with them? And part of that is, we consider it part of our responsibility to help be, good stewards of the web platform. And that means teaching people how to use the platform responsibly. Mm-hmm. And so the example that you cite is, we discovered recently, this was a huge shock to me. It turns out that if
this
you have
a big drama in the Svelte world for a moment.
It was. It really was. And I was initially quite heavily outvoted when I tried to make the case that this is an important thing to care about. So what it is you have an element like a div element or something, and you might think that an angle bracket with a div and then a closing slash and then a closing angle bracket would make that a self-contained element, but that is not actually how browsers parse HTML.
Like this.
Exactly. Yeah. It turns out that closing slash is completely ignored by browsers. And so if you have some content after that element, it will actually be included inside the element if it's parsed as HTML. But what Svelte, in common with just about every other framework, does, and this is partly because of JSX, like JSX does the same thing that I'm about to describe, is it treats that as the end of the element. And because of that, there is this very subtle incompatibility between HTML and Svelte, which claims to be a superset of HTML. And a lot of people were like, well, does it matter? Like, isn't it better if that closing slash is respected? It's what people think is going to happen. It's more convenient, arguably. So why not just go along with it? But when you start to look into it, you realize that there are definitely situations in which that can result in some pretty unexpected outcomes. And it's particularly bad when you take the knowledge that you have gained from using Svelte and try to apply it outside Svelte, whether that's just in vanilla HTML or in some other framework. If it starts behaving differently, then we haven't done our jobs correctly. Like, we have set developers up for failure. And so after a long and intense debate, we decided that we were going to align with HTML. And so in Svelte 5, if you have one of those closing slashes on an element that is not a void element, then you will get a warning. And in a future version after that, probably Svelte 6, that will become an error. We're just not going to allow you to introduce that ambiguity into the code base, because that way you can't encounter the bad outcomes. And once it was put in those terms, people came around and like, okay, yes, that is actually an important thing that a framework should take responsibility for.
And that's what you describe as being good stewards of the web, is not just passively kind of like enforcing specs, but kind of actively trying to guide people in the right direction.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to kind of do a bit of a thought experiment about how Svelte hypothetically might degrade over time. So I'm curious, if the Svelte team gave up tomorrow, and you stopped publishing updates on the Svelte repository, how long do you think it would take before Svelte builds, or SvelteKit probably specifically builds, would start failing?
It's a really interesting question. In theory, obviously, code will continue to behave the same way forever. It's a deterministic thing, right? In practice, we all know, anyone who's been developing software for any length of time knows that is not true, that there's this phenomenon called bit rot. And I think there are two basic categories of bit rot. One is the divergence between the code and people's understanding of the code. If you recycle not recycle, that's a terrible word, but if you replace the team members too frequently such that no one was around when a specific piece of code was written and can't explain what the motivations were, then you sort of have to reason from the code itself to understand what it does, and that turns out to be extremely difficult. So a lot of code just degrades because our understanding of the code degrades. But the other big category of bit rot is dependency churn. The code itself will work perfectly with the exact same set of dependencies, but as soon as you start upgrading things, you begin to introduce the potential, at least, for incompatibilities.
Yeah, and I feel like every time I try to run a project that I built a year, 2, 3 years ago, it just doesn't run. I need to spend a half an hour trying to figure out what the dependency issue is.
Yeah, and the Svelte compiler doesn't have any dependencies. Everything is basically self-contained.
Yeah, and to be fair, I'm actually not sure I've ever had that experience with Svelte. I know I've had it with other frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, we think about this stuff and we take it fairly seriously. And so the compiler is self-contained. Like, it doesn't have a dependency on Node.js, for example. You can run it in a browser, you can run it in Bun, you can run it in, whatever. And so because of that, because it's all just based on vanilla JavaScript, like, in theory, that should be pretty robust. But you asked about SvelteKit applications, and that's where it starts to get more complicated, because we don't just have the Svelte compiler. We have Vite, and we have the Vite plugin for Svelte. And you're going to be building your application today on a specific version of Node, maybe 20, maybe 22, maybe you're still on 18. And at a certain point in the future, those versions of Node will no longer be supported. And so if you try and run them, then maybe you'll discover that you need to upgrade one of the dependencies of your project. Probably not Svelte itself, but like maybe you need to upgrade to a new version of Vite. And maybe because of that, the Vite plugin Svelte integration no longer works because there's been a breaking change in Vite. And so because of that, your Vite project no longer understands how to convert Svelte files. And so there are these various things that are just kind of outside our control to a large extent. And I think this is one of the reasons that it's important to try and have as few dependencies in your projects as you possibly can. The fewer moving parts you have, the more likely it is that a few years down the line, a project will still work. Because I too have had the experience of trying to build something that may have been built relatively recently and discovering that like you just can't do it with this version of Node, and one of the dependencies doesn't support the new version, and so on. And you'll spend half an hour just playing whack-a-mole trying to get things in order, and it just won't. So I can't put a number on it. I don't know when, like, if we were to completely step away and leave everything to its own devices, when your Svelte applications would stop building. Hopefully it's not for many years, but like there are just no guarantees in this business.
So then the next step in this thought experiment is in the same scenario. At some point, would people's server logic, like if somebody has like an API endpoint or something, at some point would those stop working?
Again, I would say it's the dependencies that are probably going to be the problem there, and in this case, it's the dependency on the runtime. If you deploy those server endpoints today, they're probably going to be running on a current version of Node or a current version of Bun or Dino. And as long as those runtimes are still available, then everything should be fine. But in a future where they're out of long-term support and the platform that you're using to run your stuff doesn't support that version of Node or whatever it is anymore, then that could potentially become a problem. If you're running everything yourself, then in theory you're immune to that, but in practice you've just taken on the administrative burden of of managing that whole nightmare yourself. So I don't know. I would like to say you're safe for many years, but like you can't just.
And this is, of course, a problem, or not a problem, a question. a consideration for any kind of digital infrastructure, not just a Svelte project.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that the main problem would probably be something about versions, not about like the actual logic starting to fail because APIs change or whatever.
Yeah, and it is mostly about the non-Svelte dependencies in your app. Like we try and hew as closely as possible to the idioms of the platform and the language. So we're not using features that will suddenly not be supported in a future version. But as soon as you start having dependencies, that's when you introduce the risk of things failing. And it's not like you can avoid having dependencies. Like this, I'm not saying don't have dependencies, but maybe don't have unnecessary dependencies.
Now, if we get really existential, which we get to do because this is a thought experiment, Svelte generates HTML and some JavaScript and styles and whatnot. At some point, hypothetically, does that stop rendering? Like in time, in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years?
I think about this a lot. The web is a pretty durable medium. Sites that were built in the 90s, in many cases, render perfectly today. We've been pretty good about keeping it this backwards compatible thing. And browsers are very forgiving. They will render malformed HTML, and a lot of the time, like, you don't even know that it's malformed. And so on that basis, like, there's good reasons to be optimistic. But at the same time, like, the web as a platform isn't in the best of health. Certainly outside, North America and Europe, the web is less dominant because a lot of people outside that part of the world, they're coming to the internet for the first time using mobile devices, and on mobile phones, native apps are dominant. And so usage of the web as a proportion of usage of digital devices as a whole is in decline. And it's not clear that we're going to be able to reverse that. A lot of people just default to using native apps for everything on their phones, and even I do that. Like I tend to do my online banking with my bank's native app. I don't log into the website when I need to pay off my credit card. And so I don't know how you can resist that, and I also don't know like if that means that there will come a point in the future at which the web is no longer a stable platform to build on. I really hope that it continues to be a stable platform to build on, because I think the web is a hugely important piece of infrastructure. And I want to do my part to help keep it that way.
But browsers are very complicated pieces of software.
Browsers
right?
are extraordinarily complicated pieces of software, and they're becoming more complicated because like we keep adding stuff to the web platform. And one of the recurring thoughts that I and a lot of other people have is, like, could we make the web platform simpler and better suited to the uses that we're putting it today? And the only way that we can really do that realistically is to have some form of versioning in the platform. But then you start to break the guarantees that we talked about, that a website built in the 90s will continue to render. If it's not using the current version of the web, then maybe it's just not going to work. There's no way to square that circle in a way that we can satisfy all of these priorities, but it is definitely something that like I think we should be having more conversations about.
So back to Svelte and how Svelte itself is aging, assuming that you guys do keep working on it. Have you started to look at Svelte and the features that you have and started to say, you know what, I don't know if we need that feature anymore?
Interesting. To some extent, yes. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about styling. One of the limitations of Svelte's approach to styling is that it's more difficult than it should be to pass styles between components. You can pass data between components in the form of props, and you can also pass CSS custom properties to components. We have a convenient syntax for doing that. So like if a component exposes certain CSS custom properties and you can set them from outside, then you can theme your components. But what you can't do is say, here is a set of styles that I just want to pass into the component. And we talk a lot about whether or not we should introduce some means of doing that. But at the same time, Tailwind exists. And nowadays, a lot of people think that that is the correct solution for having, composable styles. Because it really takes the idea that we talked about in other contexts of trying to co-locate the things that matter to each other as closely as possible to its logical conclusion. Like if the styles live on the piece of markup that they address, then if you delete that piece of markup, then you no longer have anything to worry about. And if you can just pass a class name, which is a set of Tailwind classes, directly to a component, then you can solve the problem that I just described of passing styles around within your app. And so like a legitimate question would be, do we still need style encapsulation? And I think at least for now, the answer is yes, we do. There are problems that are extremely hard to solve with Tailwind that Tailwind's proponents tend to not talk about. But that is the kind of thing that we think about all the time, mostly because we just want to reduce the size of the framework as much as possible. Like we want it to have a small surface area. We want people to be able to learn it very quickly. And the more that we can cut things out that are no longer necessary, the better a job we can do of that. And Svelte 5 is actually very largely about exactly this thing. We're introducing some new concepts, but it allows us to remove a whole bunch of other concepts. And they still exist because Svelte 5 is backwards compatible with Svelte 4. Yeah. But there are certain constructs in Svelte 4 that eventually will be removed in favor of this reduced set of more flexible primitives. So yes, all the time we are always thinking about what we can get rid of and how we can do that without disrupting people and breaking their apps.
I'm thinking about how the ecosystem around animations has advanced a lot with GSAP. Obviously, we now have transitions natively in the web platform. Do you think about like maybe we don't need the animations module, maybe we don't need the transitions module?
I think we still need it. Maybe not in its current form. I think there are certain limits to the very declarative approach that Svelte has around transitions and animations. It's difficult to combine them in certain ways. But I don't think that we can just replace them with, the view transitions and things like that, because you need more programmatic control than the platform really gives you. I think view transitions are great for solving a certain subset of these problems. They are not a catch-all solution. And one of our projects for this year is going to be to think about like what the best of all possible worlds would look like in terms of power and flexibility and composability and alignment with the platform, like allowing the browser to do as much of the work as possible rather than having to do work in JavaScript at 60 frames per second. And we're not there yet. We have some sketches for what such a thing could look like, but it's definitely going to continue to be part of what the framework considers itself responsible for.
Cool. So basically, to answer the question succinctly, looking at the Svelte codebase, you don't really look at anything and think that part's going obsolete anytime soon.
Well, there are huge chunks of the code base that... So in Svelte 5, we're introducing this thing called runes. Yeah. And when you start using runes, your component is in, we call it runes mode. And when you're in runes mode, there are certain things that you can no longer do, which, at least just for the sake of having a name for it, we call legacy. We have to be careful with that word because sometimes people get a little bit squirrely when you say, oh, this is a legacy component, because that has some very negative connotations. But there are these basically just like giant if blocks inside our code base. where if you're in legacy mode, run this logic, otherwise run this logic. And at some point in the future, we're going to be able to delete one half of that if-else statement. And it's going to feel really good. We're going to be able to delete a pretty substantial amount of code. And I think people's apps will probably get a tiny bit smaller as a result, because we're not going to be carting around the compatibility layer anymore.
Healthy improvement.
Yeah.
You were on a podcast recently. Was it called Whiskey and Web Dev? I think it was on there.
Whiskey, web, and whatnot.
Okay, yeah. You said that frameworks like Rails and Laravel are kind of like the benchmark for what the JavaScript framework ecosystem should be kind of aspiring towards. But according to developer surveys, they're already in the past. Like, usage is declining. Next.js is already way past them in terms of usage. How can you look, not to say that they're in the past, but how can you look towards something that's kind of declining in popularity as a benchmark?
So for one thing, like, always got to take survey results with a little bit of a grain of salt. Part of the reason that JavaScript frameworks are so ascendant is because JavaScript itself is ascendant. For a long time, it wasn't really possible to build an entire application using JavaScript. Like, I'm old enough to remember when Node didn't exist. And you could use JavaScript for the interactive bits inside the browser, but you couldn't use it for your actual application logic or for server-side rendering. It just wasn't a thing. And it is a thing now. It's incredibly easy to write a server in JavaScript, and you can deploy it and you can propagate it all around the world immediately. And because a lot of these server runtimes have embraced web APIs, like, if you're a front-end developer, then this is a very familiar environment for you. And because there are so many JavaScript developers, like, it stands to reason that there's going to be a huge amount of growth among JavaScript frameworks. But the Railses and the Laravelses, that they've had like many years to hone what they're doing, and they've solved a lot of problems that we in the JavaScript world are only really beginning to talk about now. Now that we have a foundation to build upon, we're starting to have these conversations. And so, I think they perhaps are declining in popularity. It's honestly hard to say. But I don't think that they're declining in quality. And I don't think they're declining in terms of like the reach and the range and the ambition of what you can build. DHH always talks about how he built Rails because he wanted it to be possible for solo developers to build entire products. And can we honestly say that we're there in the JavaScript world? I think it's probably still a little bit of a stretch, if I'm honest. And so I think we should consider, if not the development experience and the specific choices that have been made in those frameworks as the benchmark, I think we should consider that goal of allowing solo developers to build very ambitious projects as a benchmark that we have yet to meet.
Mm-hmm. And you think there's still lessons in the broader exo JavaScript ecosystem?
Absolutely. It would be hubristic and foolish to imagine that we've got all of the answers. We clearly haven't. One of our mantras on the Svelte team, just in internally when we apply it to ourselves, but it really applies to everything, is no one has a monopoly on good ideas. And that goes for the JavaScript community as much as it goes for individuals. We should never stop looking outside and trying to steal other people's ideas.
Now, you mentioned how powerful it was when we brought JavaScript onto the server. And I feel like there was been a strong sense of there's something really powerful about the fact that we're breaking down walls between front end and back end, both in development and in the client. And we see that with the fact that Svelte is a front end framework and SvelteKit is a full stack framework that are created by the same team. We've got web containers which can run server code, which is actually browser code in the browser. We've got the file system API, so we're opening up the boundary between the browser and the computer. All of these, for me personally, I felt like we're opening floodgates. Like something huge is about to change in web development, and yet, like, is it?
So my investment thesis, I guess, is that the next big thing is going to be local first development. Mm-hmm. And I partly say this because of a contrarian bent, because every other framework is talking about how much they're moving stuff from the client to the server at the moment. And it feels to me like we're kind of losing sight a little bit of our home team advantage, which is the browser. And there is this burgeoning movement now of people trying to build local first applications using web technologies. For a long time, like the APIs didn't exist, like mentioned the file system API and things like that. Mm-hmm. Like these things exist now. People are starting to build the libraries for doing CRDTs and all of these things that make local first development a possibility. And it's still very early days, but I think that is like stands a pretty good chance of being like the next big thing over the next five or so years of web development.
Can you say a little bit more about what local first development is?
Yeah, essentially, so we have this assumption baked pretty deeply into web development that there is a client and there is a server, and that if you need some data, then there's going to be a network request involved, and maybe you have a local cache, but like the assumption is that everything's asynchronous, everything involves a network trip, and the local first mindset is that the data exists on the device with the application. Right, we have storage APIs. Like I have a laptop here with like a terabyte of storage.
Yeah.
I can have all of my music there if I want. I can have lots of things there. And as well as meaning that I don't need to go to the network anymore, it means that I have sovereignty over my data. It means that I don't need to worry about the privacy implications of my data living in a place that I don't control. It means that I can work on my data whether or not I have an internet connection. If I'm on a plane, if I'm on the subway, it's all just the same. And this isn't a radical idea. Like this is how applications worked for like a long time before web apps displaced everything. And there's good reasons that web apps displaced everything. Like the web is an incredible application delivery mechanism, but with that shift, we lost some of the local first mindset, and it's now starting to come back again. And I think this is truly going to be the best of both worlds.
And do you think it's technological advances that are making that possible?
It's partly technological advances. It's partly a vibe shift, I guess. I think people are starting to become more aware of like the dangers of entrusting all your data to various third parties. There have been so many instances of companies getting shut down or bought out, or data getting corrupted or lost, breached, and so on. And with that, there's also, we've talked about like the complexity that is involved in building a web application, and the idea that you can build things in a radically simpler way using familiar technologies is like super appealing to a lot of people. And so there's just momentum in that space around the tooling that is required to get there. And it feels like we're approaching a bit of a tipping point.
Do you feel like you're thinking this way because it's part of your job to anticipate what web developers are going to need in the next 5-10 years?
A little bit. Part of it is also, if I'm honest, probably confirming my priors, because this is where Svelte shines. Like we're really good at front ends. And it feels like if everyone is going in one direction, then like your best option is sometimes to go in the other direction. And I just, feel a little bit nervous about some of the ways that people talk these days about like abandoning the idea of using JavaScript to build front ends, or at least abandoning client-side JavaScript to build front ends, in favor of ideas that to me seem a little bit regressive in certain ways. Like a lot of people have decided that because of some of the complexity of single-page applications, that it's acceptable to expect that every interaction is going to involve a server round trip, and like I'm not on board with that. And so, you know, the work that I've been doing with Svelte over the last several years is, I think, really well geared towards this idea that if everyone has a supercomputer in their pockets and we can run code where the user is, then like we should capitalize on that. There's a huge amount of things that become possible when you can do that. And if it's difficult because the data is all the way over there, well, like bring the data onto the device, and then your problems start to solve themselves. And
something you've talked about, I've heard you talk a lot about, and I haven't necessarily heard it from other influencers in the web development sphere, is that like there's a lot of times when you don't have an internet connection. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you might not be able to make that round trip to the server. Is this something that's already kind of built into Svelte, or something that you're thinking about building more into Svelte with features?
It's so we definitely have conversations about like what the optimal way of loading data in a web app looks like. Svelte itself has no opinions about any of this stuff. Svelte is just a dumb rendering framework. SvelteKit is where we where we have this need to get some data from some place into your web app, and we have primitives for that. Like we have the load function, which can run on a server, or it can run both on the server and in the browser. And if you have a server-only load function, then obviously you can talk to a database directly. And that works. It's pretty good. It's proven a fairly scalable model. It's the approach that Next used for a long time. It's very similar to the approach that Remix uses. But we're definitely starting to think about what what the next iteration on that idea looks like. And React is obviously leading the pack in a lot of ways with React Server Components, and we're taking a lot of inspiration from that. But in amongst that, I at least am definitely thinking about like what are the ideal integration points between the rendering framework and the data, if the data exists in this sort of local first context.
Cool. So maybe something that we're going to hear more about in the future.
Yeah.
So going back to the beginnings of Svelte, you've said that you wanted to create the most elegant way for describing user interfaces. Why did you choose HTML and CSS for that framework?
I think those languages are somewhat maligned, but they're actually really good for the task that we use them for. And it's also the journey that most developers follow. Like generally people come into the web will learn HTML first, and then they will learn some CSS. And then once they've got those basics down, then they move on to JavaScript. That's not necessarily true nowadays. Like a lot of people, because they're sort of going to React boot camps, they are learning JavaScript on day one. But I think it's still the most tried and true way to layer that knowledge. And for me personally, maybe this is just a matter of preference, but that is how I want to work. And so when it came time to build tooling, that was like my natural bias. And also with Svelte, I was building something to essentially replace a previous framework that I had built called Reactive. And we were using it at work, and I wanted something that the team would be able to use and be familiar with. And so some of it is just like inheriting previous design decisions. And I think that's like a recurring theme with a lot of these sorts of projects is a lot of the decisions are like they have good solid post hoc rationalizations, but a lot of time it's just like the evolutionary path that they took.
Yeah.
But it's one that I definitely enjoy and stand by. I do think that if you're learning web development, that is the easiest path.
Yeah. And it seems like something that I think that's cool about Svelte is that theoretically, if you write HTML in Svelte, you can copy paste it to your browser. If you write CSS in Svelte, more or less, for the most part, you can copy paste it to your browser. But when it comes to logic, like functionality, JavaScript, but also like your logic blocks and stuff like that, you can't copy paste it to the browser. It's you've kind of like turned Svelte into like a superset of JavaScript in a way. What was it about JavaScript that made you say, we're going to kind of take the reins on this one?
Again, I think it's like an evolutionary accident of history. To some extent, I was very influenced by the existing templating languages that existed when Svelte and its predecessor were created. And a lot of those things are things that we sort of turn up on nose a little bit nowadays, things like mustache and handlebars. Like one of the creators of mustache.js is Michael Jackson, who now like famously works on React Router and Remix and so on, and like is very, very scathing about like the concept of templating languages generally. And I think that it's one of those things where, because there were obvious flaws with the idea of templating languages at the time, there was this real overcorrection towards, we need to use the most powerful and flexible language to do the most basic tasks. And it turns out that a lot of the time, having that extra power and flexibility actually isn't all that advantageous. We were looking at an example a while back of iterating over an array of numbers.
Yeah.
And like being able to do that with a domain-specific language is very often the much more natural choice.
Yeah.
People are very skeptical of DSLs, like in general. Like, why would you use a domain-specific language when you could use like the all-purpose language? To which my response is, why wouldn't you use a domain-specific language? Like, you want to use a language that is specific to your domain, and that is gonna allow you to express the thing that you're trying to express, often much more cleanly and concisely.
So HTML is a domain-specific language. CSS is a domain-specific language. Is it fair to say that you're kind of creating your own almost Svelte script as a domain-specific language for behavior?
To an extent, yes. I think this is perhaps less true in Svelte 5 than it is in Svelte 4. Like, we obviously are adding things to JavaScript that aren't there most of the time, like namely runes. But it's very clearly signposted. The ways in which we deviate from the semantics of JavaScript, for example, assignments causing things to update, which is not a thing that happens in normal JavaScript. Like these are the things that you learn within the first 5 minutes of using Svelte. And the way that I see it is we're really sort of papering over the limitations of the platform. We're allowing JavaScript and HTML and CSS to be used to describe things that they weren't originally designed for, but which they're so close to being really good for.
Especially with runes, you're sort of augmenting JavaScript. Do you worry that adds a significant load on the maintenance of Svelte or vulnerabilities in the future of Svelte?
We design runes in such a way that it would be something that we would be able to maintain, that we'd be able to add new features to over time. One of the standout features of Svelte 3 and 4 obviously is the $: syntax for describing a statement that should rerun when its dependencies change. And people like that because it's very concise, and it's very descriptive. Like there's not a lot of code there that isn't directly expressing your intent. Very little boilerplate. But it turns out that syntax doesn't work in a lot of contexts all that well. For example, it's hard to do advanced typing if you're using labels, and you can't use those labels outside Svelte components, because if you want to use that inside a TypeScript file, then if you're declaring something with that syntax, TypeScript will see that and say, well, you're just assigning to an undeclared variable. In the context of a .svelte file, because there's a layer between us and the TypeScript compiler, we can say, oh, no, it's fine. We'll just declare it in this invisible block of code immediately before the declaration. And TypeScript's like, oh, okay, seems like they know what's going on. But you can't do that if you're trying to do things in a .js and .ts file. And so one of our design constraints when we were coming up with the replacement for all that was we need something that is going to play really well with TypeScript, because a lot of people use TypeScript. And runes work beautifully with TypeScript. Because as far as TypeScript is concerned, like the state rune, for example, is just the identity function. And so because of that, we don't have any of the caveats that prevented us from using Svelte primitives outside Svelte components. And so now we're able to describe state in separate shared modules, and it's like really convenient. You're not switching between different modes of reactivity all the time. And as we've gone on the journey of developing this thing, and we've discovered that there are things that we didn't initially anticipate, we've found that runes have been a super flexible and adaptable primitive to accommodate all of these things as we find them. So I'm pretty confident that that's going to serve us pretty well.
Makes me think of when I was in university, there was a kind of buzz phrase that we used a lot: an elegant solution to a complex problem.
Right. I mean, what we're going for here is like one approach that, like, you learn one thing, which is we have this token, this symbol, this magical symbol, which instructs the compiler in some regard. And once you've learned that concept, you can apply it to all of the different individual use cases. Whereas previously, let count equals 0. Well, count is reactive if you subsequently have an assignment inside a closure. If you put an export in front of it, it becomes a prop. If you have $:, then it becomes a reaction. Mm-hmm. And all of these things are like little extra things that you have to learn in order to be productive with Svelte. Mm-hmm. And we feel like the surface area is being reduced quite substantially by just making you learn this one concept that can then be applied to all these different problems. And
so, like you're saying, something that's kind of big innovation in Svelte 5 is that you can now write Svelte logic in JavaScript files. Granted, they have to be .svelte.js or TS files. How do you see that going? Does Svelte eventually kind of consume all the JavaScript the files in your application? Do they all get subsumed under Svelte logic?
Generally, no. When we've been converting applications, there's very often you might have a module that contains a lot of store logic, and maybe that becomes a .svelte.js file or .svelte.ts, and you replace those stores with the state rune equivalents. But it tends to be fairly localized. It doesn't end up consuming your entire code base. It's not like and this is one of the great things about signals as a primitive, is that they don't tend to take over your code base in the way that some things do. There's a famous essay I think it's called "What Color Is Your Function?" And it's basically describing how as soon as you have an async function, if you use that function in another context, then that function also has to become async, and eventually the async colored functions take over the entire code base. And we see that also with things like observables. I've often found that observables are a little bit of a pain to work with because they tend to infect your code base, and signals don't do that. And what we've kind of done is we've integrated signals into the language itself so that it feels like you're just writing with normal JavaScript values. You're not having to deal with like an API on top of them. And yeah, it's proven to be a pretty successful idea at allowing you to do all of the things that you need to do with reactive state without taking over your code base and turning everything into Svelte.
Yeah, runes are obviously, I can already see in the way that, in my experience working with Svelte 5, a really powerful way to refactor your code base and add, like you're saying, these kind of magical powers. And if you want to learn more about runes, you can also check out this video where we recorded a demo of talking about what runes are and how to use them. So we're talking about when does this all end. And it's a thought experiment. It's philosophical, but I think it's a really interesting question. I often, when I look at a skyscraper, I wonder, like, when they built that, were they thinking about, the day they would have to tear it down? And so I pose that question to you, like, when would you feel like, I'm happy, we can call it a day,
I mean, not for a long time. I'm happy with the contribution that we've made to web development. Like, I think we've introduced some ideas into the popular lexicon, and we've had an impact on how other frameworks think about design. But there's still like a huge amount of work to do. Ultimately, it may not be up to us though, because people might just move on to another thing, and that's fine. That's the natural ebb and flow of these things. And so I guess our challenge is to keep advancing the state of the art and to continue to be like, give people a reason to use Svelte. There is a little bit of a danger there. Like, if the reason that you're working on a thing is to keep attracting people to use a thing, as opposed to because you genuinely have new contributions to make, then eventually things can get stale.
Yeah.
And like, I don't want Svelte to ever become a project that exists for its own sake. But I don't think there's any immediate danger of that. I think we still have so much work to do.
I mean, it seems like in the long term, there's kind of two directions you can go. One is, like we talk about jQuery as if it's in the past, but it's just so baked into the web that obviously jQuery's, they're going to be maintaining jQuery forever because it's essential public service at this point. The other one is that, like, it actually does kind of get forgotten, and you stop maintaining it, it falls apart, and nobody really cares because nobody's really using it anymore. What direction would you rather go?
What would make me sad is if in the future someone has to work on a Svelte code base and they're like, oh, what is this? What were they thinking back in the 2020s? Hopefully we can stay closely enough aligned to the platform that it never feels like this really weird thing, that like this sort of collective psychosis that, like, sometimes when you look at old code, you do have that moment of like, what were we doing? Why did we make those choices? And that's something that we talk about sometimes. It's like, is this decision going to stand the test of time? And there are definitely some decisions that we made in previous versions of Svelte that I don't think stood the test of time, and that's why we release new versions that change those decisions. But I think that we've been doing this for long enough now that we've developed a pretty good sense of taste. I mean, I say that maybe in 3 years I'll look back and think that was a horribly naive statement, but a lot of the people who work on the framework have been doing so for a long time, and we've got I think a pretty confident sense of self and like what we stand for, and so hopefully we won't inflict that fate on people. So
one way or another, you're hoping that what the legacy is that in 20, 30, 40 years, people look back on this code and they go, oh, this was kind of innovative code. Yeah, I mean, the ideal scenario is that some of these ideas get kind of incorporated into the language itself in some way. An example of the kind of thing I'm talking about is that there is currently an effort underway to bring signals to JavaScript, the language. And we can take very limited credit for that. Like, Svelte is tangentially involved in that effort, but it's really something that's been driven by primarily by other frameworks. Solid obviously deserves a lot of the credit for popularizing the idea of signals in front-end frameworks. But if that happens, then that is the sort of thing that, like, maybe we can kind of melt away that part of the framework. Scope CSS is perhaps another example of something that, like, up until recently, you needed a framework to do that. Now it is part of CSS, the language, and it is possible that we're going to be able to incorporate that into the framework in such a way that, like, we're more closely aligned with the platform than we are today. So, I feel like part of the job of designing a framework is to create
expand the sense of like what the platform should be capable of doing, and then eventually we pave the cow paths, and the frameworks can get smaller and conceptually leaner over time. So in that way, you can sort of avoid becoming legacy by having the platform consume you, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, that does make sense. It seems kind of interesting that you're in this unique position where you more or less as a volunteer on your evenings and weekends and through your job too, you started working on this project that was seemingly kind of a passion project, and it's turned into something that people really kind of depend on. Like, people are using it. It's the existence of Svelte is now important to some number of people. In that, like, if you decided to give up and become a baker, it would probably be inconvenient, if not catastrophic for some people. Does that come with some sense of responsibility?
Absolutely. And I love baking, so it's not an outlandish idea. I definitely do think about that. There are like people throughout the, I don't know what's the word, supply chain, who have some investment in Svelte continuing to exist. There's the people who work on it directly, including people who work with me at Vercel and are like paid a salary to work on it. It's obviously important to us that it continues to be a thing. It's important to other contributors who work directly on it. It's important to people who use it in their applications, and like ultimately, it's indirectly important to the people who use those applications. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole bunch of people who, without like seeking this situation, we sort of stumbled into a situation where people depend on us, and we take that very seriously. We talk all the time about like how we can evolve the framework without making life difficult for the people who have chosen to invest in the framework. And it's hard, and I can't tell you that we have a plan exactly for the day that we stop working on it, other than not stopping working on it. Luckily, I think there's still a lot of enthusiasm and investment in the project. Like, I don't feel burnt out. Mm-hmm. I feel like we have a huge amount of energy, a huge amount of ideas of things that we want to achieve with the framework. So it's not something that is top of mind right now, but eventually we are going to need to think about that.
Yeah.
Because what tends to happen is projects, for whatever reason, die or become abandoned, and people are left with technical debt in their code base. Mm. And I'd be very upset if people came to regret having believed in the framework and chosen it to build their applications with.
Amazing. I mean, thank you so much for all that advice. I mean, there you go. If you want to create your own JavaScript framework, please go ahead, do it, and let us know. You can share it with us on the Prismic Community Forum or in the comments below. We would love to hear what you're working on. In the meantime, if you just want to see what Svelte is like, get a sense for the excellent API design that we've been talking about, you can create a Svelte project from the Prismic dashboard, link below. And if you want to learn more about where Svelte came from, how Rich had the idea, and how the Svelte team has built the framework over the years, you can check out our feature interview with Alex just there.